A political shockwave is unfolding across the world, and at the center of it is a question many people are asking in different ways. How did things reach this point so quickly? And why does it feel like everything is collapsing at the same time? Over the past few days, events have not unfolded as isolated incidents, but as a connected chain that is reshaping political alliances, public trust, and global influence. At the start of the week, the American president was posting aggressively on social media late into the night. His messages were aimed at the Pope, at NATO, and even at political figures who were once considered loyal allies within his own political circle. One post followed another in rapid succession, creating a sense of constant conflict coming from the highest office in the United States. While this was happening online, another major shift was taking place quietly but powerfully on the global stage. In Beijing, Xi Jinping was hosting a series of high-level meetings with global leaders. Within just 1 week, he met with the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, the Prime Minister of Spain, the Foreign Minister of Russia, and the President of Vietnam. These meetings were not loud or dramatic. They were structured, strategic, and deliberate. The message being sent was not through words, but through presence. Global diplomacy was being reorganized with China at the center. This contrast became impossible to ignore. While one world leader appeared to be engaged in constant public conflict, another was steadily building diplomatic influence with multiple regions at once. One was broadcasting tension, while the other was building alignment. This is why the conversation online and in media circles has shifted so sharply. Many are asking what is wrong with Donald Trump, but that question may miss the deeper issue. The more important question is what happens when a president enters a major conflict and discovers in real time and in full public view that he is increasingly isolated. What we are witnessing is not just a moment of political pressure or a series of unfortunate events. It appears to be a structural breakdown unfolding across multiple fronts at once. Instead of one crisis triggering another, everything seems to be collapsing simultaneously, creating a chain reaction that is difficult to stop. There are 5 major fronts where this breakdown is becoming visible. Each one on its own would be serious but manageable. Together, they form a pattern that is much harder to contain. The first of these fronts is internal, and it involves the president's own political base and closest supporters. Before looking at foreign relations or economic consequences, it is important to understand what is happening inside his own movement. Because historically, no political leader survives long when pressure begins to build from within their own ranks. External enemies can be managed, negotiated with, or confronted. Internal division, however, often signals something far more serious. Over the past week, criticism has not only increased, but has also changed in tone and origin. Figures who were once firmly aligned with Trump are now openly questioning his leadership, his decisions, and even his mental and moral judgment. This is not a shift coming from opposition parties alone. It is coming from within his own ideological space. The first and most serious front is not foreign policy, not economics, and not even international pressure. It is something far more dangerous for any leader: internal collapse. A president can survive hostility from abroad, but it becomes much harder to survive when resistance begins forming inside his own political base. Over the past week, voices that once stood firmly behind Donald Trump have started to openly turn against him. One of the most striking examples comes from Marjorie Taylor Greene, a figure who was widely seen as one of his most loyal allies in Congress. In a highly controversial statement, she publicly described his behavior in deeply critical religious terms, even using language suggesting a spiritual or moral corruption. On national television, she went further and said he should be removed from office. This is not coming from the political opposition. It is coming from within his own movement. At the same time, other influential conservative voices have begun to break away. Candace Owens, who has been one of the most vocal right-wing commentators, publicly stated that Trump appears to be under a dangerous influence, framing her criticism in moral and spiritual terms. Dave Smith, a well-known podcast commentator who previously supported Trump, described what he sees as political self-destruction, arguing that Trump demands complete loyalty while offering very little stability or trust in return. Smith also made a deeper observation that goes beyond personality politics. He suggested that Trump may even prefer a scenario where his own party loses after he leaves office, rather than allowing another Republican figure to rise and take his place. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, it highlights a growing concern within parts of his base, that the political system is increasingly centered around one individual rather than a stable party structure. This leads to a more structural issue. When a political machine becomes dependent on a single figure, everyone inside that system eventually starts to understand that they are not equal participants. They are not partners in a shared mission. They are instruments serving one central point of power. And when that realization spreads, loyalty begins to weaken. This is exactly what is now being observed across segments of the MAGA movement. High-profile figures such as Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Alex Jones, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Candace Owens are either directly criticizing Trump or distancing themselves from him in different ways. These are not minor influencers. They are some of the most visible voices in the entire ecosystem that once supported him strongly. At the same time, Trump himself has publicly attacked several of these figures. The conflict is no longer limited to external political opponents. It is now occurring within the same ideological space, creating visible fractures inside what was once considered a unified movement. This internal instability is now being reflected in political action as well. In Congress, discussions have begun about evaluating the president's fitness for office. A group of House Democrats has introduced measures under the 25th Amendment framework to assess presidential capability. In addition, dozens of lawmakers have called for impeachment or removal proceedings. Even within traditionally strong Republican regions, concern is beginning to surface. A Republican senator from Wyoming, one of the most conservative states in the country, publicly noted rising pressure on basic support systems like food banks, signaling economic stress among voters. When concerns like this come from within safe political territory, it suggests that the foundation is starting to weaken. This is the key point. The problem is no longer isolated incidents or individual disagreements. It is a pattern of fragmentation, and it is not happening in one place. It is spreading across political allies, media supporters, elected officials, and even within the broader voter base. Once internal support begins to fracture at multiple levels simultaneously, it becomes extremely difficult to stabilize. And as we move forward, this internal pressure connects directly with what is happening outside the country, where global alliances are also beginning to shift. What is unfolding inside the United States is only one side of the story. The second major front is happening outside the country. And it is arguably even more significant because it involves the global system that once revolved heavily around American leadership. That system is now showing visible signs of realignment. While the American president was engaged in intense and often controversial social media activity, world leaders were making calculated diplomatic moves that suggested a shift in global power dynamics. Several key governments are no longer waiting for clarity or stability from Washington. Instead, they are beginning to adjust their strategies independently. In the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister delivered a statement in Parliament that carried major geopolitical weight. He declared that the conflict in question was not Britain's war, and emphasized that it was not legal under international interpretation. He also stated that despite significant pressure, he would not change his position. This was not a symbolic remark. It reflected a firm distancing from direct alignment. In Europe, similar patterns are emerging. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who was previously viewed as ideologically close to Trump's political worldview, publicly criticized his statements regarding the Pope, calling them unacceptable. This created an unusual situation where leaders who were once considered aligned are now openly in disagreement. Trump's response only escalated tensions further, turning what could have been diplomatic distance into public political conflict. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, often described as one of the strongest nationalist leaders in Europe and a figure previously praised by American conservative commentators, recently faced a significant political setback. Reports of declining political influence and electoral challenges suggest that even leaders once seen as part of a shared ideological wave are now under pressure. The broader message being sent is that political alignment with Trump-style politics is no longer guaranteed to produce stability or electoral strength. At the same time, a broader strategic shift is being reported across Europe. According to multiple financial and defense analyses, several nations, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Nordic countries, Canada, and Australia, are exploring frameworks that would allow NATO-style coordination with reduced dependence on the United States. This concept, sometimes described as a European NATO, reflects a growing desire for strategic autonomy. Even Finland's leadership has directly communicated to American officials that Europe is actively building its own defense capabilities. This is not framed as hostility, but as preparation. It signals that allies are no longer assuming permanent American leadership in security matters. Outside Europe, similar realignments are visible in Asia and the Middle East. In Beijing, China hosted an unusually dense series of high-level diplomatic meetings in a single week. Leaders from the United Arab Emirates, Spain, Russia, and Vietnam all participated in discussions. These are not random visits. They represent an expanding diplomatic network centered around China as a stabilizing hub of global engagement. While these meetings were taking place, Xi Jinping positioned China as a consistent and structured global actor, contrasting sharply with the instability seen in Western political messaging. The perception being built is not just about economic power, but about reliability and predictability in international relations. In the Middle East, another important signal came from Saudi Arabia's top foreign policy official. He stated clearly that the country now formulates its policies solely based on national interests, pursuing opportunities in both the West and the East. In diplomatic language, this is widely interpreted as strategic diversification, away from exclusive alliances. This matters because Saudi Arabia has historically played a central role in the global oil and financial system tied closely to American influence. Any shift in its positioning suggests a broader weakening of old alignment structures. Taken together, these developments point to a world that is no longer waiting for a single dominant power to set direction. Instead, multiple centers of influence are emerging, and countries are adjusting accordingly. And as these external shifts accelerate, pressure continues to build from another direction entirely. Adversaries who are no longer acting cautiously, but confidently. The third front in this unfolding situation comes from direct adversaries, and it highlights something critical about power in international relations. Deterrence only works when it is believed. Once that belief breaks, the entire structure of control begins to weaken, and rebuilding it becomes extremely difficult. In traditional military strategy, deterrence is not about action itself, but about credibility. An opponent must believe that consequences are real, immediate, and unavoidable. The moment that belief disappears, deterrence collapses, regardless of how strong the military capability actually is. Over the past period, signals from Iran suggest that this perception has shifted. Iranian state-linked social media activity has become increasingly bold and openly provocative. Content mocking the American president has circulated widely, including memes and edited images that portray him in highly disrespectful ways. One widely discussed example involved an AI-generated image previously shared online being altered and repurposed in a way meant to undermine authority and symbolism. More importantly, Iranian commentary has begun to openly question American political stability, including discussions around the possibility of leadership changes within the United States. While these statements reflect Iran's perspective and propaganda environment, what matters analytically is the confidence behind them. The tone has shifted from caution to direct challenge. According to accounts linked to Iranian negotiating circles, there is also a belief that the United States has lost strategic leverage in recent discussions. These claims suggest that during diplomatic talks, American representatives were perceived as inconsistent in their positions, with changes in negotiating stance occurring after internal consultations. Whether fully accurate or not, the perception itself is important because negotiations are driven as much by belief in consistency as by formal power. There are also reports of disagreements during discussions over strategic waterways, including demands related to shared control or access. The response from the Iranian side, as described in these accounts, was dismissive, rejecting external authority over key maritime routes. This reflects a broader pattern, a growing unwillingness to accept pressure in negotiations that were once heavily influenced by American leverage. The key shift here is not just disagreement, but confidence. When an adversary begins to act as though outcomes are already decided in their favor, it changes the entire negotiation dynamic. At that point, the leverage is no longer primarily military or economic. It becomes psychological and reputational. This is where credibility becomes central. If a state or leader is perceived as inconsistent or unpredictable, every future negotiation starts from a weaker position. Opponents test boundaries more aggressively. Not necessarily because they are stronger, but because they believe consequences are less certain. This perception feeds directly into broader strategic behavior. When adversaries believe deterrence has weakened, they become more willing to take risks, push limits, and publicly challenge authority. That is what makes this stage particularly unstable. It is not open war, but it is no longer stable peace either. At the same time, another pressure point is forming in a different domain entirely. While geopolitical confidence is shifting abroad, the physical and economic mechanisms that support global power are also beginning to show strain. This brings us to the fourth front, where enforcement and control over key strategic routes are being tested in real time. The fourth front is the enforcement of economic and military control, specifically around one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. This is where declarations of power meet physical reality, and where gaps between announcement and execution become visible. At the center of this situation is the Strait of Hormuz, a critical passage for global energy transportation. A statement was issued by United States Central Command claiming that a blockade of Iranian ports had been fully implemented. The message suggested that maritime movement in and out of Iranian ports had been significantly restricted, signaling what was described as maritime superiority. However, when independent commercial shipping data is examined, a very different picture emerges. Multiple vessels continue to move through the region during the same period. Reports indicate that several Iranian-linked ships departed and entered the strait without interception. Among them was a Chinese-owned tanker already under U.S. sanctions, which passed through openly while transmitting its tracking signal. It carried industrial cargo and continued its route without disruption. Another large oil tanker, also previously blacklisted, reportedly moved through the same waters carrying crude oil. These movements were visible and traceable, suggesting that enforcement was not fully preventing passage through the region. What makes this situation more complex is the way shipping routes are being adapted. Some vessels are reportedly using logistical strategies that involve loading cargo near Iranian ports and then transiting through alternative regional ports before continuing their journey. This creates a legal and operational gray zone where restrictions become difficult to enforce consistently. Technically, some movements are structured to avoid direct classification as violations, even if the practical flow of goods remains unchanged. This creates a situation where the appearance of control does not fully match operational reality. On paper, restrictions exist. In practice, trade continues in modified forms that reduce the effectiveness of enforcement mechanisms. Meanwhile, political messaging continues to project confidence. Statements from leadership suggest that progress is being made and that negotiations are close to resolution. Similar claims have been made repeatedly over recent weeks, with expectations of imminent agreements being communicated multiple times, yet without a finalized outcome. This gap between expectation and result creates a credibility issue. When repeated assurances do not translate into visible outcomes, both domestic and international observers begin to adjust their assumptions. Confidence in messaging weakens, and alternative interpretations start to gain traction. This is important because economic pressure and military signaling depend heavily on belief. If markets, allies, or adversaries no longer fully trust announcements, then each new declaration carries less weight than the previous one. Over time, this reduces the effectiveness of both deterrence and negotiation. At the same time, broader economic conditions are beginning to reflect the impact of these geopolitical disruptions. Inflation data shows upward pressure, particularly in energy-related sectors. Oil and fuel prices are reacting to instability in supply routes, and those changes are beginning to filter through transportation, manufacturing, and food production costs. Energy is not just a single category in the economy. It is embedded in nearly every system that moves goods, produces food, and delivers services. When energy prices rise, the effect spreads across the entire economic structure, rather than remaining isolated. This leads directly into a feedback loop. Geopolitical tension increases energy risk increases inflation, inflation weakens household purchasing power, and weakened purchasing power reduces political stability. That reduced stability then increases pressure on leadership to resolve conflicts quickly, often without optimal conditions. This cycle is difficult to interrupt because each stage reinforces the next. Economic tools alone cannot resolve military or geopolitical instability, and military action alone cannot stabilize economic perception. The result is a system where pressure accumulates faster than solutions can be implemented. And as this economic strain builds, it connects directly to the final and most politically sensitive front, the domestic economy itself, where public support ultimately determines how long any strategy can sustain itself. The fifth and final front is the economy, and unlike the others, this is the one that ultimately determines political survival. Leaders can endure diplomatic isolation for a time. They can even withstand military setbacks or internal political criticism. But when economic pressure reaches ordinary citizens, support begins to shift in a much more immediate and irreversible way. Recent inflation data shows that price levels have continued to rise, with energy costs playing a central role. Gasoline prices have increased significantly in a short period, and this is not happening in isolation. It is directly connected to instability in global supply routes and rising uncertainty in energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz remains a key pressure point. Even partial disruption or perceived risk in that region has a global impact because a large share of the world's oil supply moves through it. As inventories tighten and supply chains adjust, analysts are already projecting that the baseline price of crude oil may have permanently shifted upward. This means that even if conditions stabilize later, the old normal prices are unlikely to return. This creates a structural change in the economy. Higher energy costs do not remain limited to fuel stations. They spread into transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and retail. Every product that is shipped depends on fuel. Every item that is produced depends on energy. Even food prices are influenced by fertilizer and transportation costs tied to oil. As a result, inflation becomes embedded across multiple layers of the economy, not just in one category. This is what makes it particularly difficult to reverse quickly. Once energy sets a higher baseline, every other sector adjusts upward over time. International economic forecasts are also beginning to reflect this pressure. Growth projections in several regions have been revised downward. Economies in parts of the Middle East are expected to contract, while neighboring countries are also facing reduced stability due to regional uncertainty. These effects do not remain localized. They spread through trade, investment, and energy dependency. What emerges from this is a feedback loop that is difficult to break. Conflict raises oil prices. Higher oil prices drive inflation. Inflation reduces household purchasing power. Reduced purchasing power weakens political support. Weakened political support increases pressure on leadership to de-escalate quickly. But rapid de-escalation without strategic resolution can signal weakness, which may encourage further challenges abroad. That, in turn, can prolong instability and keep energy prices elevated. This cycle reinforces itself unless a stable and credible resolution is achieved. Economic institutions like central banks have limited tools in this environment. They can manage interest rates and liquidity, but they cannot directly resolve supply shocks or geopolitical conflicts. Fiscal tools are similarly constrained when the root cause lies outside domestic policy. This is why the economy is not just another front in this situation. It is the final deciding factor. Public opinion, voter behavior, and political survival are all tied directly to whether households feel financial pressure easing or worsening over time. And when all five fronts are viewed together, a broader pattern becomes visible. Internal political fragmentation, global realignment, adversary confidence shifts, enforcement gaps, and economic strain are not separate events. They are interconnected pressures forming one system of stress. Historically, when all these pressures align at once, outcomes tend to move quickly because systems lose their ability to absorb shocks. That is what makes this moment so significant. It is not one crisis unfolding in isolation. It is multiple crises reinforcing each other at the same time. And that brings us to the final conclusion of this analysis. Five fronts, one structure, and a political system that is increasingly struggling to hold them together under sustained pressure.